Good evening. I'm Marion Dry, Chair of ClassACT HR73, and it is my honor to welcome you to this ClassACT Forum, Freedom of the Press, Views from the Frontline. This forum is the fifth in our Democracy at 250 series and the final forum for this spring season. We have an extraordinary lineup for you in this panel, and we're most grateful to have them here. ClassACT HR73 forums bring experts and practitioners together to discuss the state of our world and the issues we face in this very challenging time. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dick Toffel. He's class of Harvard's 1979 and is the former president of ProPublica and former assistant publisher of the Wall Street Journal. These days, Dick, among other things, writes the second rough draft newsletter on Substack. So we encourage you to subscribe to his Substack. Welcome, Dick.
Thank you, Marion. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. We have three outstanding panelists with us today, and I'll introduce them in a minute. We'll then have a conversation and conclude that, leaving plenty of time for your questions. In alphabetical order, our guests are Bruce Brown is the president of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Washington. He joined RCFP 14 years ago. Prior to that, he was a partner in the DC office of the law firm Baker and Hostetler. His undergraduate degree is from Stanford. He got a master's in English literature at Harvard, where he was a Mellon Fellow and then went to Yale Law School. Along the way, he was also a reporter at Legal Times and a newsroom assistant to the late, great David Broder of the Washington Post. David McCraw is senior vice president of the New York Times and its lead newsroom lawyer. He has been at the Times for 21 years. Before joining the Times, he was the newsroom lawyer at the New York Daily News, and earlier an associate at Rogers and Wells and its successor firm, Clifford Chance. He has degrees from the University of Illinois, Cornell, and Albany Law School, teaches a course on press law at Harvard Law School. He is the author of the book, Truth in Our Times, Inside the Fight for Press Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts. And Francia Garcia Hernandez is a reporter for Black Club Chicago, covering the Pilsen, Little Village, and Back of the Yard neighborhoods. She is originally from Mexico City and earned her undergraduate degree from Universidad Anahuac, Mexico Norte. She also has a master's in civic media from Columbia College Chicago. In addition to Block Club, she has written for a number of other publications, including the Chicago Sun-Times. She was one of the lead reporters for Block Club's coverage last year of ICE's Operation Midway Blitz, which in many ways was the prelude to what happened in Minneapolis. I want to start with Bruce, whose experience in this moment includes that of many newsrooms. Bruce, first, for those who may not know, can you give a very brief overview of the sorts of work the Reporters Committee does, and then tell us what you see as the greatest threats to press freedom in the country at the moment?
Dick, thank you, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight. I guess it's a good news, bad news story that the Reporters Committee, which is a legal nonprofit, as Dick said, based in DC, now has almost 30 lawyers, making us one of the largest practice groups of media lawyers in the country. When I started 14 years ago, there were two or three of us. So there's been, a tremendous growth in the need for our work out there, and we have filled, a very specific gap in the last dozen years as the economic contraction has taken place within many legacy media organizations, and reporters have gone out on their own. They've started nonprofit organizations in their communities. There's been a need for lawyers to take on direct representation for those journalists. And prior to the last dozen or so years, the Reporters Committee was doing things we're still doing, like amicus briefs, and we do trainings for reporters, and we have a 24/7 hotline that journalists and media lawyers can call in emergencies. But the big difference for us is direct representation. At any given time now, Dick, we have about 120 or 130 cases, active cases on our docket, and they're all around the country. They're federal court, they're state court, some libel defense, some access, some public record, some subpoena defense, and everything is pro bono.
Okay. And the second part of the question, what do you see as the greatest threats to press freedom around the country at this point?
Right. And I'll answer the question in part by how I responded to a similar question about 6 months ago, where I was asked on a scale of 1 to 5, five in that person's mind being the worst, where we were. And I was in a room of journalists and I said, well, I think we're about at a 2. And there was sort of a gasp in the room because I think most of the reporters thought I would say 4 or 5. How could it just be 2? The first year of the new administration has been exhausting. And I said, well, we've got important cases out there we're working on, the access cases that David can be speaking about later with the New York Times and the Pentagon, the AP and the White House, the funding cases involving AP and the appropriations case involving Voice of America, but that it could get so much worse. And that's why we were just at 2. And then we come back from the holidays, and very soon Hannah Nathanson's house is searched. And suddenly we're easily at 4, right? Because there you have the first search of a reporter's home in a national security case in the country's history, right? And so even though that was not a direct application of the Espionage Act to a journalist, a direct prosecution, which I think we would all agree is when the red light goes on and we're at 5. The Nathanson case was a huge reminder of how quickly it can get worse. And before you turn to the next question, for someone else, I would say with Nathanson, I'm a little less worried now than I was a few months ago because the courts have really stepped in to slow down DOJ in that search, and the reprimand that the DOJ lawyers got, both, initially from the magistrate judge, but now his ruling's been affirmed by the district court judge, setting up protective protocols for the search of Hannah's devices. I think that the fear of a direct prosecution at this point may be slightly mitigated because of the challenges that DOJ has encountered at the district court. But right, in a month it could be different. But right now I'm feeling a little bit better about hitting 5.
For the non-lawyers or the non-junkies, let me just briefly double back and sort of detail that case for people briefly. On Hannah Nathanson was the lead reporter for a Washington Post project, actually, that won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service on Monday for its work on Doge and other efforts to undermine, I think it would be fair to say, the structure of the federal government. On Christmas Eve of last year, the Washington Post published under her byline a story that detailed her personal involvement in talking to, I believe she said, over 100 sources, mostly on Signal on her phone in a confidential way. And as Bruce indicated, the government then raided her home and seized her electronic devices. And as he also, in part in connection with the prosecution of at least one of her sources, they said, and there is such a prosecution of someone who the government alleges to have been her source. The government still has her devices, and at the moment, the fight is between the government and the Post about the extent to which the government will be allowed to search the devices for information potentially relevant to the prosecution, or whether in the alternative, the court will do its own search. And the judgment so far by, as Bruce indicated, both the magistrate and the district judge is that the court is going to do the search and not allow the government to roam through the devices.
Right.
Bruce, can I just ask you to be somewhat more general and say, other than searches of reporters, what do you see as the major threats at this point?
In the category of other threats, I would probably turn to some of the strategies that if you got a dozen media lawyers together in a room 2 years ago, they might not have come up with the fact that the federal anti-stalking statute, might be used against a journalist, which we learned a couple weeks ago, was not the case at the FBI when they did an initial inquiry of a New York Times reporter under that statute. And the fact that there are federal criminal laws that are vague, that might be applied to news gathering, or at least attempted to be applied to news gathering, like the Don Lemon, Georgia Fort case in Minneapolis, there where they have been indicted under the FACE Act and federal anti-conspiracy statutes. Those strategies to us feel like a very poor fit to news gathering, and we're confident that we're going to end up with some good law in these areas if these cases proceed. But I would say that, Dick, the trying to imagine where the next assault may come from under a vague criminal statute is probably, other than the Espionage Act, the thing that we worry about the most.
Great. All right. Thank you. David, I want to turn next to you. Can you give our audience a recap of the New York Times, a brief recap of the New York Times' legal experience over the last 10 years with the president? And for this purpose, I'd really like to stick for the moment with overt legal threats and actual litigation.
And thank you, Dick, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. Needless to say, the president's lawyers are frequent pen pals of mine, so they write to me, including on Christmas Eve when I got a visit from St. Lawyer, threatening to sue us over a story that said that Donald Trump didn't like exercise, something he admitted to 3 days later in the Wall Street Journal. So that sort of is the noise in the background. We were sued in 2020 by the Trump for President campaign over an op-ed written by the great Max Frankel, our retired editor, which is a case we won. We were then sued in 2021 by the president himself on a strange case where he claimed that our reporters had overborne the will of his niece to get confidential documents. The Trump family had entered into a non-disclosure agreement to settle a estate dispute, and our reporters, working through Mary Trump, the president's niece, were able to get documents that were covered by that NDA, and the president, at that point ex-president, alleged that we had engaged in so-called tortious interference by luring his niece to provide us with documents. We won that case, and he paid us $390,000 in legal fees. More recently, we have seen he sued us for libel in Tampa, Florida, in the federal court there, over a couple of stories, one of which dealt with his time at The Apprentice, and one of which was sort of a compendium just before the election of some of the financial failings, legal problems, and other controversies he had been involved in. That case is still pending. We all obviously have all seen pressure on our reporters. Bruce raised the issue of something we reported a couple of weeks ago, which was that one of our reporters was investigated for engaging what we think of as routine news gathering. She was covering a story about Kash Patel's girlfriend, and that led to at least a momentary investigation of whether she was in violation of the federal stalking statute. More recently yet, yesterday.
And if I can
Yeah,
just interrupt for
sure.
a second, David, just to say the stalking in this case involved knocking on her door, correct?
I involved calling her on the phone.
Okay.
They've never been in each other's physical presence.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry. Go ahead.
right. And then yesterday, some of you may have seen the EOC sued the New York Times on behalf of a employee who says that he was discriminated against for being white. So this, and I think that kind of underscores in answer to a question you asked, Bruce, what the threat is. I think that just as the universities are finding, I think people in the news media are finding that there is a whole of government approach that's being used, that it's not one thing, it's all kinds of different things, whether that's the Federal Communications Commission going after ABC, whether that is the FTC going after Media Matters, or whether it's EEOC bringing a case against the New York Times.
And just to be clear, the president also has pending libel actions against, I know, the Wall Street Journal for disclosing the birthday note that he gave to for Jeffrey Epstein, and he has a libel action pending against the Pulitzer Prize Board um, for the awarding of the Pulitzer Prize during his first term to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Does he have other pending? Am I missing anything?
BBC, the
I'm sorry,
BBC.
BBC.
the
Yeah.
BBC, right? Sorry, and the BBC, as well as the actions that he settled. And just so people understand the broader context, in the sweep of American history from 1789 and the initiation of the presidency until 2017, no president had ever sued any no sitting president had ever sued any news organization for defamation.
Right. And true to my Midwestern roots, we should bring up that he's also sued the Des Moines Register
Sure.
just before he became president the second time.
Yeah.
Right. And that is for the fact that they published an outlier and, in retrospect, faulty, off base poll indicating that the vote in Iowa would be closer than it turned out being.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. It's enormously helpful context. Francia, many people watching aren't from Chicagoland and may not be familiar with the work of Block Club Chicago. Can you start by giving a brief description of your organization and then tell us about your own experience covering Operation Midway Blitz last year, including the personal challenges it posed?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Blog Club Chicago is a nonprofit newsroom based in Chicago. We're committed to providing hyper-local news. So what this looks like in practice is, reporters have different groups of neighborhoods in the city of Chicago that we cover day in and day out, bringing all sorts of local stories. We cover politics, we cover arts, we cover quirky things happening in the neighborhood. Obviously, when federal agents arrived to the city of Chicago for Operation Midway Blitz. This impacted many of the neighborhoods we cover. I cover neighborhoods in the southwest side of the city that are home to majority immigrant communities, mostly Latino immigrant communities. So these were some of the most affected by ICE and Border Patrol operations. Um, as you know, as on a side note, we are a small nonprofit newsroom and we're used to covering sometimes protests, sometimes unrest, sometimes, crime stories. But this was unprecedented in the way that we saw hundreds of federal agents moving in caravans through the city of Chicago, targeting people who looked Latino or who looked like an immigrant, and then detaining them, no questions asked, no warrants asked. They were often masked, heavily armed, and it was really, escalating quickly as this started in September and it moved through the end of the year through mid-November and then for a few days back in December. So it was very challenging for reporters like me. I'm an immigrant. I am an immigrant reporter covering immigration stories. And there was a real threat to immigrant reporters, and frankly, any reporter when federal agents were using chemical agents and chemical weapons. One of our investigations with several other newsrooms revealed that the federal administration used chemical weapons at least 49 times in the city of Chicago. And, if anyone's familiar with the use of pepper spray or gas, if the military was to use it, there are strict protocols as to how they can use pepper spray or gas. This was not being followed here. It was widely used as protesters and neighbors gathered to document arrests, including members of the press. And it was widely used outside of the detention center in Broadview here in Chicago, where people gathered to protest, and detainees were held in really terrible conditions that led to a lawsuit as well. So, that's a little bit of what we saw and experienced personally as someone who is an immigrant reporter. The challenge was doing my news gathering functions while staying safe and assessing risks live. Every time I was on the ground, and I was on the ground often, it was a situation where I was gathering pictures, video, talking to witnesses and sources, but also constantly monitoring for any changes in crowds or agents' behavior to prevent being detained. And wondering whether my immigration status could be used against me during my reporting.
Yeah, and there is, I noticed already put in the chat, a really extraordinary first person story that Francia wrote toward the end of last year, I think, right? About this experience, which I commend to you as part of the really amazing reporting she did then. Francia, David commented a little bit on Bruce's list of the most significant threats. Do you have any you would add to that, or from the local level, I expect you see it somewhat differently? What do you see as the greatest threats to press freedom at this point?
Yes, I think at the local level, the threats are similar because we look to the national media to see what the federal administration is doing to target journalists or persecute them for their reporting. But there's also an intersection, as I was talking about, for those immigrant reporters or reporters who are DACA recipients or, reporters from communities that are typically underrepresented that would have a more complicated case if they were to be detained for their journalism and they have a complex immigration status situation. Many local newsrooms are not even equipped with a non-staff lawyer, let alone a lawyer that could handle a complex immigration case. So that's been challenging. And for many of us here in Chicago, we reporters who cover immigration from multiple outlets and even freelancers, we gathered at the beginning of the second Trump administration informally just through online meetings to talk about this risk, to do safety trainings, to be prepared to have documents ready in case anybody was detained. And one of the things that we found too is that we started to see some immigrant journalists detained last year. At the start of last year, Mario Guevara, a journalist in Atlanta, Georgia, was detained while covering a protest, and he was detained by local sheriff's office and then transferred into ICE custody. He spent around 100 days in ICE detention and was later deported. Most recently, Stephanie Rodriguez in Nashville, Tennessee, an immigrant reporter who had both a pending asylum case and a green card application through her husband, was detained for her, it appears to be for her news gathering, even though ICE has claimed it was because of her complications in her immigration status. But evidence suggests that she had been followed and targeted for her reporting. So for many of us who are in local newsrooms in smaller cities and have these intersections of immigration and journalism and risks that we are taking, these actions send a threatening message, and one that we must consider as we try to do our work.
Yeah, Francia and I were in the audience on, I guess it was Saturday, when there was an extraordinary, was it Friday or Saturday? I forget. But anyway, in Berkeley, there was an extraordinary interview with this woman in Nashville, and it's under, I think you can find it at the Logan Symposium site in Berkeley. I really commend it to people. An amazing conversation and a horrifying story. Um, so, not all of these threats, of course, come from the government. Putting aside the places for which you each work, how well do you think the press, do each of you think the press is responding to these various problems? And specifically, what do you think have been the most effective ways that the press has acted collectively, and where, if anywhere, do any of you think that it's missed the opportunity to do so?
We do a lot of amicus work at RCFP, and
Can you
you
just,
know,
Bruce,
oh
for
sure,
civilians,
right, um, right. We
file
uh,
friend of the court, sorry, file
yeah,
friend of the
yeah,
court briefs
right.
in pending cases?
In pending cases where, and we do about 60 or 70 of those a year, where the Reporters Committee is putting together a coalition of press freedom organizations and companies to support a piece of litigation that's pending involving another organization. And we found it a little harder in the last year and a half to build the size of the coalitions that we were able to previously. Particularly, some of the broadcast companies have been reluctant to put their name on the dotted line. When it came to the New York Times lawsuit against the Pentagon, we were just sort of shocked that though we were able to get press freedom groups on our amicus brief, we were not able at the trial court level to get companies to uh, put their names on the brief. And that was a real disappointment for us. The Times lawyers quipped when I said, "What is it going to take to get them on a DC Circuit brief?" And they said, "After we win at the trial court, they'll come on the DC Circuit brief." But that was a real disappointment that the media companies didn't support the Times there. And I should let someone else jump in. I have a couple thoughts about some
Yeah.
of the news coverage of these issues, but I want to let others speak up.
I want to back up for a second. David, can you fill folks in on what happened at the Pentagon that gave rise to your litigation and where it stands at the moment?
Yeah. Last fall, the Pentagon announced new rules for getting a press pass. The press pass is a fairly simple thing to understand, which is it's a badge that reporters who regularly cover an agency like the Pentagon get, and allows them to easy access to the building so that they can do interviews, go to press conferences, and the like. And that has always been sort of here's where you can park and here's where you can go, and they do a background check and you're good to go. The Pentagon decided that system, which had been in place for decades, wasn't good enough, and that instead they were requiring reporters to agree that they would not seek information from unauthorized sources. In other words, if you wanted to do a story about the military and you wanted to have a press pass, you could only publish authorized comments from the press spokesman or from senior officials. We felt that was a direct attack on journalism, and in one of the shows of solidarity, which I think is worth remembering, everybody else thought the same way, and whether they were affiliated with the right, the left, the center, they refused to do that. So Fox News joined the New York Times, Newsmax joined the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and everybody else in refusing to do that. But we also thought that it violated the Constitution. It was a direct attack on freedom of speech, that it was an attempt to try to control the press in ways that the Constitution didn't allow. And so we sued. I won't go into the legal arguments, but we succeeded. We won at the district court. That case is now on appeal to the DC Circuit, and we plan to continue to vigorously pursue it. We think we're on the right side on this, that agencies under the First Amendment can't use a device like a press pass to deny us the normal the normal conduct that reporters have always engaged in, talking to sources, getting information, and going behind the scenes and helping the public understand what's really going on in the military.
Francia, from your perspective, how well do you think the press is doing in responding to all of this, and how effective or not has collective action been?
I would say for many local newsrooms, and I would say here in Chicago, it's certainly the case. All of us unified, and many of us as journalists collaborated in different ways to cover federal government actions in our communities, in our cities. The Chicago Tribune just won a Pulitzer for their coverage of Operation Midway Blitz, but our friends at the Chicago Sun-Times and other local news media did investigations and day in and day out reporting that really helps shed light on the federal administration's actions here in Chicago. I think that's a major win at a time when, small newsrooms are often competing for readers and for resources and support. And we also, I think, look at the work of national outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, ProPublica. Many of them are able to do some of the investigative work on the federal government's policies, particularly in immigration, but everything else going at the Department of Homeland Security to kind of understand how that could have a trickle effect in our communities. So I think that that's a great way of seeing how the media at the national level and the local level kind of informs and helps each other and builds on the work of each other. There are certainly more opportunities to collaborate and to do more, but I think we've seen a lot of outlets unify and work together, and we've seen a lot of readers and frankly people in the city of Chicago kind of support that work and really be grateful for it.
Dick, if I could jump in here,
Yeah, please.
Just a nuance, I think, on this, which is that um, we are competitors, that, and the public benefits from that. That when we take on the Wall Street Journal, the CNN takes on us, or the Post takes on us, that's good. That's good for the public to have that kind of competition. And so there's a little uneasiness about collective action that just grows out of that. I think there's also a certain uneasiness about collective action that grows out of the fact that it plays into one of the president's favorite tropes, which is the press is out to get me, that there are all these people who are aligned against me. We are adversarial to the government, but we don't care who the president is. We need to be adversarial to the government, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, or anyone else. And so I think it's always a little hard. But I do think there's an opportunity for us to make make these issues accessible to the public. I think we need to cover them. I think journalists need to take seriously that these things matter. You wrote in your Substack a very, very insightful piece about how too often on our editorial page, not just us, but everybody, we talk about freedom of the press as something that it's good for the press, when we should really be trying to help people understand there's a reason for freedom of the press. It's for the benefit of democracy and for people, and we should write as if people mattered. And I think that's a really important message for us to get out over and over again.
Yeah, thank you. So David, you adverted to the difficulty sometimes of collective action. In the Pentagon, notwithstanding Bruce's point that people were reluctant to join a legal case, as you said, everybody walked out together pretty much and said, we're not playing by Secretary Hegseth's new rules. There was an earlier case, maybe 6 months or more, at the White House involving the AP, where the AP's access to the Oval Office and the presidential pool coverage and the airplane was limited because the AP, which sets the style for most journalism organizations in the country, refused in its official style book to accede to the president's request to rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And because they refused to do that, he threw them out, and the AP sued. In that case, which was much earlier in the administration, I think it's fair to say that while the AP got some support from editorial pages, it got essentially none from other reporters taking action. Um, in retrospect, Bruce, David, was that a mistake?
Well, Dick, when AP story first arose, we had some board members at the Reporters Committee who remembered that during the Obama administration, there was a short-lived effort to freeze out Fox News. And there you did have a concerted, coordinated effort, among others. This was the White House again. It was White House press coverage, press pool, and they did support Fox, and they, said there's going to be a walkout if you don't let Fox back in the group, and that strategy succeeded. And the White House backed down. And I will say on our own board, it was interesting because there was a real divided um, response to the AP situation that, some board members advocated for a walkout, byline strike, whatever to do to show that they weren't going to play ball. And then others felt, as David said, he articulated the position really well, that that ran the risk of looking like, the press was playing out exactly Trump's trope that they're all against him and this is theater, and it's not for us as a legal services organization to lead in that area. We did do an amicus brief for the AP at the DC Circuit, and that brief did attract wide support. The case is still pending, but that probably in the course of the last year has been the case that we've had the most signatories on a brief.
I have to say, Dick, that and to Bruce's point, the world of media, and you know this well, has really changed from when at the beginning of the Obama administration, you could have a boycott of the other major broadcast networks that mattered. When the reporters walked out of the Pentagon, all the press passes were given to right-wing influencers,
Yeah.
people on TikTok and so forth. We walk out, others are going to come in. Who gets served by that? And I think that some of the practical reality of that is that I'm not sure those kind of boycotts, whether they're advisable or not, work. The second point I'd make about that is, if you talk to average people, should the president be allowed to punish a news organization that will not say Gulf of America? People would say, of course not. Not in America. That's free speech. There's free press. And the amazing thing is the AP has such a difficult case. And you start to realize how complicated the First Amendment doctrines have become. One of my students this spring at the law school, is writing a paper on how the First Amendment has become so disassociated from what it was intended to do, which is to prevent people in power from dictating what a free press should do. And then the last thing I would say, and kind of what we can do, and this goes to a point that Francia was making earlier. I think those of us who are in the privileged position of being successful national news organizations, international news organizations, have to be mindful that what we do actually helps news organizations across the country. That when we need to go out and win cases that matter because the law will help others, I think we need to provide whatever support we can. As you know, Dick, we have a local investigative journalism fellowship where we're partnering with local news organizations to give them editors and legal help and so forth, so they can do investigative pieces that matter. And I just think that if I were to, you ask whether to fault somebody, I think that that effort needs to be done by a lot of the other privileged international national media.
Yeah, certainly agree with that. David, in preparing for this panel, said that he thought that the press was in a fight for the hearts and minds of the American people. I'd love to hear from each of you, starting with you, Francia, if we could, about how you think that fight is going.
Oh, that's a difficult question. I think at the local level and for Blog Club Chicago, it's certainly true. We have really shown a new model for nonprofit local news organizations to really connect with our audience, to really connect with our readers, to bring information and news that matter to them and get them to support us. A lot of our, revenue comes from supporters and subscribers and donations. And I think that's really promising and exciting at a time when many news deserts exist across the country and many local news outlets have disappeared. I think it's exciting to see that that support exists and that there's still ways that we can reach people interested in news and local news. But at the same time, we face challenges like we've been talking about in all sorts of legal, physical, and sometimes even financial ways that can make it really challenging to get that support from the American public. One thing that I didn't mention earlier is Blog Club Chicago was part of a lawsuit along with other news outlets and news skills here in Chicago to obtain footage and to obtain an injunction relief from federal agents using tear gas and pepper bullets on reporters and peaceful protesters during Operation Midway Blitz. And while we were a much smaller newsroom, we were able to do this in partnership with other outlets and with a local law firm, just as a way to show that we care as much as the big national media about our readers and about holding the government accountable and doing whatever it takes to get the information out there and get the stories published. So that's worked in our favor. I think people really valued that we did that, valued our coverage and valued that work. But obviously the challenges still persist to the media as a whole.
Yeah. Bruce, how do you think the fight? I'm going to come back, David, to
Yeah.
let you answer your own question last. But Bruce, how do you think the fight for hearts and minds is going?
I think we're still really struggling with it. And, I had to laugh when David talked about the complexity of the AP case. And as a lawyer, I'm thinking, what's complex about the limited purpose public forum doctrine? That's exactly the way we can't be talking to the public. And we at the Reporters Committee have struggled with the messaging. We tried very hard to lean into democracy and that idiom, over the 24 campaign. I can't say that we felt it was very effective in our work. We do have a local program that we run in which we embed a single pro bono lawyer in a specific state. And all that lawyer does is work for nonprofit media and media coalitions in those states. And we picked hard states, states where there are very few resources like Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, and so on. And there, we're able to talk about the very practical way in which legal work and press freedom work produces more information for people to make decisions in their lives. It's the city council, it's the school board, it's the local, budget process in their county. And I think right now it's a little bit easier to talk, Dick, in that context than it is in the bigger national context.
David, how do you think the struggle for hearts and minds is going?
We got a ways to go. You know, as I said during the prep session, when you see the White House say that it's fake news and press is the enemy of the people and all of that, and then 5 days later you see FBI agents raiding a Post reporter's home, as Bruce referred to, those two things aren't unrelated. If you are able to convince the public that that the journalists are bad actors, that they can't be trusted, that they don't have a role to play in democracy, that they're against America, it becomes much easier to do the kind of oppressive things that we have seen, including the raid. It's very tough to be a citizen today. Let's just be honest about it, that what you would really want is discerning citizens who are spending the time to figure out what's true. And I think there are a lot of people out there who want to do that. And boy, does the media ecosystem make that difficult. If you think back to 2016, that when the Trump campaign did the first really successful social media campaign aimed at Black voters and Hispanic voters, they did not try to get them to vote for Trump. They got them to stay home. They essentially said, Hillary's not to be trusted, to think about what her husband did, and so forth and so on, and that became a much easier ask, was to be apathetic, to turn it off. And I fear that that's part of what's going on now, both from the sheer volume of social media messages, but also the amount of disinformation and misinformation that's being officially sponsored and put out. If you try to cover Iran over the last 24 hours and decide, I was going to use the word war, but I understand the war is over, at least at one wing of the White House, but not in the other. How are you supposed to sort through all that?
Yeah.
There's been a fair amount of tumult in and from media ownership during the first 15, 16 months of the second Trump term. CBS was sold. CNN is in the process of being sold into the same hands. The Washington Post has been gutted by its own owner and its editorial page philosophy transformed. Chain newspapers and print circulation continue to disappear. What do each of you see as the implications for press freedom of these shifts in the media business?
I can jump in there, Dick,
Yeah,
with just a
thanks.
couple of thoughts. One, as an observation, for a number of years, I've gone out to the Stanford campus to talk to the Knight journalism fellows there. Half are from the US, half are from overseas. And this year, some of the reporters who came from places like Russia, Brazil, Turkey, felt like it was their turn to lecture me, right? Because they have seen consolidation in their countries where the party in power moves the levers, right, of the merger and acquisition levers, so that favored individuals get control of media companies and the disfavored ones are pushed out. And so we're seeing that here, right? And it's something the Times in their series on and study of the way that press freedom erodes overseas, as they, David could speak about that. There's the 4 or 5 countries they picked and the strategies that are used, and then you see it exactly playing out in the U.S. And of course, if I can be parochial, there are just fewer companies to support the reporters committees too. So, that's another really bad effect. The other thing I was going to say about the media business, and this is coming a little bit from left field, I know that you weren't directing conversation, particularly in this area. But I am optimistic that we're going to get through this, and that we may even have stronger precedent in some of the key constitutional First Amendment news gathering areas. And it is possible that 10 years from now, we look back and we decide that the most important case affecting the news media right now is New York Times versus OpenAI. And maybe David, could speak to that. But in terms of industry shifts and media power, I don't know if there's a more important case going on right now. So wanted to put that on the table too.
All right, David, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, this is going to be a very simplistic view because I think it's a simple case, and that is the New York Times has sued OpenAI and has sued Microsoft and has now sued Perplexity, all AI companies, for training their AI uh, uh, tools on our content. They went out and swept up everybody's copyrighted content across the internet, and they did not pay for it. And they intend to make a whole lot of money from it. And to my way of thinking of it, and at the heart of our suit, that's stealing, and that creators should be compensated. Creators should be compensated, and copyrights should be honored. So I appreciate what Bruce has to say. I think it is an important suit and goes to the finances of the industry and how news organizations are going to survive. The thing I would go from there, Dick, though, because you raised a really important question. You look at the networks, which, like the universities, find they are deeply interconnected to the federal government. whether they're trying to do mergers, whether they're trying to get licenses for their stations, and that the federal government has a great deal of clout over them. And what I think that requires, and I think this has always been true, that owners of news organizations, not every one of them, but a lot of them understood it wasn't like a widget business, that you sometimes had to do things that were contrary to your business interests. I remember that when I first came to the Times, that I ran into the publisher in the hall, and BizDay had greeted our newest board member by doing an expose of her company. and, and, he sort of said, if you're going to be on the Times board, you're going to have to live with that. That's how that works. And it really requires some fortitude. I'm not at the table when ABC decides to pay Donald Trump a settlement in a libel case. I'm not at the table when CBS decides to pay Donald Trump millions of dollars for a consumer fraud complaint of all things. But I can tell you that the impact of those settlements is really significant. It undermines public trust in the news organizations. We look just like businesses. We have fewer allies, as Bruce is saying, when you see that. And I do think that I really like the Jeff Bezos of 2020 a whole lot better than Jeff Bezos of 2026.
Yeah. I want to get to Francia in a minute, and then we're going to go to your questions from the audience. One quick thing, David, about the AI litigation. The old principles, I think it is fair to say that the two basic principles of copyright and the news business were, but check me on this, that the news is not copyrightable, but the expression of it is. And that unless the court is going to go, ultimately the courts, but ultimately the Supreme Court, unless we are going to go back on almost 100 years of law, those are the two principles we're trying to reconcile here. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, although they're not really using our facts. It becomes more of an issue now with AI enhanced searches. But they were essentially training the models to know about language, and they were using it to make those models. And then those models did in fact have output that, as we show in our complaint, are in fact the expression of the New York Times. We have 100 examples in Exhibit J of our complaint showing that you could ask at the time Chat GPT, OpenAI's product, to produce New York Times stories, and it would do it.
Francia, thoughts about the impact of the news business on the practice of journalism?
Yes, it's actually a question that I grappled with during Operation Midway Blitz, as I saw really, a lot of Spanish speaker and immigrant audiences don't always go to the New York Times or, CNN. They might go to local outlets. They might go to Spanish speaking media. They might go to social media. They might go to TikTok or WhatsApp. So as, journalists, we're really competing with all sorts of mediums that are providing information. Sometimes it's not vetted, sometimes it's not produced by journalists, but the need for information at that time was big. And, I saw information sharing in real time happening in all scales and at all times. But it was not always produced by journalists. So I think that's something to consider too, how, as we're navigating changes in AI and social media and media consumption, and we're reaching audiences, and being threatened by, mergers and the federal government's actions, how can we still reach the people that journalists intend to serve and really bring that information when they need it and at the time they need it in the platform that they use? So that's something that I've thought about a lot while doing these local news stories and trying to think of how, sometimes I would consume information from the New York Times and understand how ICE works. but not everybody who was deeply impacted by ICE operations understood that because they don't have access to that information. So how do we bridge those gaps, and how do we really compete with influencers, content creators, or those who are just putting out misinformation and disinformation that at the time of Midway Blitz, it had real harms and it had real effects when people decided not to send their kids to school because they saw somewhere online that ICE was grabbing everybody. That has real consequences. So how do we as journalists bridge those gaps and really bring information and discern through the noise of content and AI generated content and news that are not news and things that ChatGPT blurts out that are not really facts?
Let me take a few of the questions we've gotten from the audience. First, it's sort of a statement, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but isn't the Trump strategy to ignore the legal merits and inflict pain, sending a message to journalists if they challenge Trump that they will go after them? The journalists may eventually win in court, but is a cost of defense and stress they purposely inflict. Does that resonate with you all?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And the bigger companies can bear the pain better, of course, than the smaller ones. And the concern is that while we know that the reporters at the New York Times who have David and his colleagues behind them aren't going to be intimidated by that, that someone in Francia's situation, although we're going to exchange numbers, Francia. So, don't worry, we're going to be there for you.
Thank you.
And we're at a very good price point. I think you would, 0 is a good place to be. That's how we've built our practice, is just price competition. But the worry, of course, is that there are so many freelancers and so many small organizations, Dick, they see the pain, right? And, are they going to feel that someone has their back? Will they do that investigation? Are they concerned that the Trump tactics filter down to the local level? So the premise of the question is exactly right.
Yeah, and I would connect that as well to make a couple observations. One is a lot of the attacks are really on norms, things that aren't subject to the law. I'll give you the example. The first encounter with the Pete Hegseth Pentagon was the decision to throw the New York Times, NBC, AP, and others out of their cubicles. There's no constitutional right to a
Right.
cubicle. I've made some preposterous arguments in my life, but I've never argued for the constitutional right to a cubicle. And why? It's just a good thing. It was a good thing to have the major news organizations. We were replaced by the New York Post. I love the New York Post. They don't have a Pentagon correspondent, so I don't know why they needed a cubicle. But it's to make a point that you guys don't matter. You're not going to get you don't get assigned space inside. And it's a little bit like who gets called on at the press conference and all of that sort of thing. So attack on norms matter. And on the legal point, I do applaud the work that Bruce has done and that Lawyers for Reporters has done and the legal clinics have done, because for a lot of small news organizations, when they're being bullied, just having a lawyer who can respond can make a difference. It doesn't have to be a great letter. It doesn't have to be a great phone call sometimes. It's just realizing that there's somebody there. And the last thing I'd say is, despite all of that, there's so many great journalists across America, like Francia, who are still willing to do it. So I really applaud them when they do not have the comfort and luxury of the New York Times behind them, that the decision to go out and tell important stories is still very much alive in this country.
Francie, I'd love to hear from you on this. I will just say first, and I don't know whether we can pull up some of the links to it, but the opposite of intimidation is giving David the chance to write one of his famous letters back.
Yeah.
Um, David has written 2 or 3 letters to the president's lawyers over the years that, from my perspective, it was an injustice that he be paid on the day he wrote them, because he was clearly having way too much fun. Francia.
Yes. Well, thanks, Bruce and David, for offering that support. I think that's been critical for many of us. And I would say the work goes beyond having a lawyer. It's also the training, the webinars, many of the education programs for journalists like me that we took for free and were really helpful in understanding how to assess risk. I think it's like the intimidation is the point. I and many other immigrant reporters or people who cover immigration, we follow some of these cases that are, prosecutions of journalists or prosecutions of immigrant journalists or detentions. And every single one of them is a hint into what could happen to us. Luckily, I think many of us are journalists, so we understand the facts and we understand the law. We're not lawyers, but we do a really good job of trying to understand how government is supposed to work. And we understand that we're doing a job that's allowed by the Constitution, right? I'm doing my job and I am exercising my right to a free press by doing that and helping the American public exercise their rights too. So I understand that my work is not something that should be deemed illegal, but nevertheless, I have to be careful and take consideration of the risk that I'm taking. And that's something that really should not be happening. So I'm not fully intimidated, but I do keep track of what's happening.
Mm.
Um, Here's another one from the audience. What can be done, if anything, I suppose, about the administration's use of Brendan Carr to weaponize the FCC to go after any broadcaster who says something they don't like? Thoughts?
I think you're really
Yeah,
back to the courts. I mean, you
yeah,
have to, I
yeah,
mean, it's a two-step process, right? The networks have to decide they're not going to take it.
right.
They're not going to cave in, and they have kind of a mixed record on that so far. We'll see what happens now. But much as, and this goes to what Bruce was saying earlier, is that much of what's going on in this country has now come down to the federal judges,
Right.
whether they can stand up and stop what it seems to be and is an abuse of power.
And
100%, David. Yeah,
before we move on to Bruce,
yeah.
David, having raised that question, what would you give as sort of the midterm grade on that?
Of the federal judges.
Yes.
Well, shall I use the 5-point scale? I think I think they've done on balance they've done an outstanding job. I think that one of the things we see, which is not true for immigration and other issues that are close to MAGA's heart, a lot of the conservative judges are libertarians and side with the free press. They have kind of a view of the First Amendment that goes back to the idea that everybody should have the chance to speak. As some of you will know, the famous case out of Texas, via Real, where a reporter was arrested for asking for information from the police. Ultimately, those charges were dropped. She then challenged the arrest, and in the Fifth Circuit, in the first Fifth Circuit opinion, James Host, probably the most conservative judge, one of the most conservative judges in America, began by saying, if the First Amendment means anything, it's the right to ask questions of government officials.
Right.
That was not, he saw right through to kind of what the First Amendment was about.
Yeah. It's also, I think, important for people to note, and they sometimes frequently forget, that Citizens United, which is a very important case in many ways for the conservative Supreme Court majority and a lot of conservative legal thinkers in the country, is at bottom, whether you like it or not, a First Amendment case. Bruce?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the question is right, spot on in that when I said earlier that some of the broadcast companies have been reluctant to put their names on briefs, it's not because they're scared of losing licenses, really, right? It's that in an age of consolidation, which is the other thing Carr is doing, right, is that he's making it easier for the bigger to get bigger, for the mid-sized companies to sell. Favored players will get a prompt antitrust blessing. Those companies don't want to do anything that could put their M&A options at risk. And I think that the best news stories about Carr are the ones that make it very clear that he can't just pull licenses, right? I mean, it's like the president threatening to jail journalists. The steps that would have to take place before any journalist in a leak investigation would be facing, possible contempt and jail time or numerous. And on the grading of the judges, uh, just looking at the cases we've talked about today, you've got a Reagan era judge on the VOA case, you've got a Trump appointee on the AP case, in Paul Friedman in David's New York Times case, you've got another Democratic appointee. They come from a wide range of backgrounds and presidential sponsors, and I think they're all, in my view, getting an A so far. They've really been terrific.
Um, we've got another question here. Is there any risk that the Supreme Court could change the Sullivan against New York Times test for that governs defamation litigation? David, Bruce?
David, you want to go first?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
I don't think that's happening. And of course, as uh, Dick and Bruce, in New York State, it wouldn't matter. As a matter of state law, actual malice is the standard. The Sullivan standard
Yeah.
is built into state law. But I don't think there's a lot of appetite at the Supreme Court to change it.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. And I did a panel about a month ago with Adam Liptak, the New York Times Supreme Court reporter, and Emily Bazelon, the Times Magazine reporter, and Floyd Abrams. And that question was asked. Everyone was very adamant in saying no. And then Floyd, the dean of all of us, kind of smiled, and he's got this big bright smile, and he's said, "I sure hope not."
I will
So,
say, just having spent a fair amount of time on this one myself, I think people thought the risks of this were much greater 3 or 4 years ago, when
yeah,
Justice Gorsuch wrote in a concurring opinion or dissenting opinion, I guess, that indicated that he was thinking about this, but there has really been no other indications. And because Times Against Sullivan is wrapped up in First Amendment doctrine more broadly, that actually underpins a lot of the agenda of the majority of the court. Um, that would be my view,
And
um,
and
as
and
well.
and the Times versus Sullivan is very, very agnostic about
yeah,
what it
right,
believes. When the Florida legislature in its wisdom, there you can see the air quotes, decided that it was that to try to undo Times versus Sullivan through legislation, the legislature did not, when that effort was defeated, they didn't care what the New York Times thought. What they cared about was the number of right-wing radio broadcasters, religious broadcasters who showed up and said, "What are you doing? We
right,
need Times versus Sullivan."
Right. It is also the case that, the basic law of Times Against Sullivan, for people who are not intimately familiar with it, is that um, you are on safe ground unless you say something that you are subjectively aware was probably false. And I think it is almost certainly the case, whether you like him or not, that one of the people most protected by that rule of law is the current president of the United
right,
States.
right.
Bruce, and maybe the last question we'll see here is, can you give us an update on the status and maybe describe it? We adverted to it earlier, but I'd love to sort of spell it out for people, the status of the Don Lemon and Georgia Ford cases.
Sure, I can do that. When members of the audience, I assume are familiar that there was an anti-ICE protest that took place in a church in Minneapolis, and Don Lemon and Georgia Fort both received word, as journalists often do, covering protests. And I'm sure Francia could speak to this, how common it is to find out from a source that a protest may be taking place and at a certain time and a certain location, and you show up and you're there and ready to cover it. They came to the church. The protesters went inside. They followed. There's a very long Don Lemon video of hours, really, of footage of his arrival at the church. And he's driving, he comes in, he goes inside, he interviews people. The inside the church itself, he was probably there for maybe 20, 25 minutes, something like that. He's asked to leave. He doesn't leave right away. He does a few more interviews. He eventually does leave. I'm less familiar with Georgia's footage. Maybe others on the panel are, but my understanding is that she had a pretty similar experience. And for anyone who works in media law, at the most, you might have a prosecutor who is looking at a case against protesters under state trespass law. A prosecutor might look at the journalists at the same time. And we've worked on a number of those cases at the Reporters Committee through the years. And the cases against the journalists inevitably fizzle out. Sometimes the cases against protesters proceed. But when prosecutors weigh the resource, the cost of you bringing the journalist into the protester case, are they going to succeed in front of a jury? Are they going to be able to prove that the journalist who was there to cover a story had the requisite intent to disrupt the use of property by a property owner? The prosecutors inevitably pass on the case or juries acquit. Here, the federal government, and I'm going to truncate the procedural piece of it because it was a little complicated, but eventually the federal government gets an indictment against Fort and Lemon under the federal statute that was passed, I think, over 20 years ago to protect access to abortion and reproductive health facilities from protesters who would congregate around them. And this is the kind of thing where the legal fellows at the Reporters Committee get asked, has the FACE Act, that's the acronym, has the FACE Act been ever applied to news gathering? And that's like, going to be a pretty simple question to research. Of course not. And it was added, or, a companion charge was under a federal anti-conspiracy statute that had also never been applied to news gathering. And both Georgia and Don have excellent counsel, and they are filing a dismissal papers around the indictment. Later this month, I believe, is the new deadline. The Reporters Committee will be doing an amicus brief in early June. And our main argument will be that these federal statutes are a poor fit for news gathering, and that applied in this way, they would violate the rights of the journalists in news gathering, and the indictment should be dismissed.
Yeah. So, Fritzy, I'd like to come back to you, and and then we're going to wind up about. I think one of the things that people don't understand, which runs through all of this, it's should be illegal to call people on the phone, to call Kash Patel's girlfriend on the phone, or to knock on somebody's door, or to stay inside a church trying to ask questions. I'd love to hear your reflections on that, and just about the fact that journalism, what we ask journalists to do, frequently requires them being what in other circumstances people might consider slightly impolite.
Yes, that's accurate. Journalists ask difficult questions, and not everybody likes being asked difficult questions. We insist it's our job to talk to multiple sources in a story and get answers. So somebody may not want to talk to a reporter and hang up, and I'll call you again, and I'll leave a message, and I'll text you, and I'll email. It's not, it's nothing more than doing my job and doing my job right, because I need to hear from multiple sources to verify facts, to get information, to get the side of the story. But it's also a lot of, as you mentioned, like in-person news gatherings, sometimes at protests, you're not going to be calling 100 protesters who you don't know even who they are to see what happened. You go to the site of a protest, you observe, you take notes, you take videos, you take photos, and then you assemble a collection of facts to then make it into a story. So we do a number of things that are, very essential and very, for many, it might seem like basic or obvious. But really, if anyone looked at the work that goes behind the story, sometimes a paragraph in a story took a day of reporting, just, following someone, going to a protest, gathering facts, looking at court records, verifying that whatever is being said about what happened in the ground is what's on the court records, looking at documents, calling people, calling them again to verify what they said. So it's a lot of work. And it is very concerning to see that some of these basic functions of our job and frankly things that we need to do to keep reporting every day are being challenged or being framed as something that could be, could lead to a federal charge or federal prison. Just like being in a protest, Bruce mentioned, we often, as local reporters, we get tips about small demonstrations, small protests, coalitions that are rallying for something. We hear when they're going to be gathering, where they'll be gathering, and oftentimes we can also know if there's some sort of civil unrest that's expected based on who's attending. So we get a lot of this information and we go to report. That's doing our job. That doesn't mean we are doing anything illegal.
And also, of course, thank you. That was very well said. And of course, the flip side of this is if that work was not done, people would object on the very decent, correct basis. You're not being fair to the people you're writing about if you're not giving them a full and fair opportunity to respond to what you're going to report. Um,
Right.
Marion, I think it's time for us to throw this over to you.
Well, thank you. And you have set the chat on fire here. There are so many people who are asking to get information so that they can know what they can do to be supportive. And Class Act always has calls to action. So I'd like to ask each of you to give the audience calls to action that they can figure out what they can do to be supportive of freedom of the press. So I'm going to reach out to Francia first, please.
Yes, as I've been talking about, and it might be no surprise to everybody, please support local journalism, support your local news outlets. If you're in Chicago, you have family in Chicago, support Block Club Chicago. You can subscribe, you can donate, you can share our stories, follow us on social media. And if you're not in Chicago, find your local news outlets. And there might be plenty. There might be, legacy media outlets, and there might be nonprofits, and there might be some that are doing some really innovative work. Find them, support them, donate to them, share their stories, amplify that work.
Thank you. Bruce.
At the Reporters Committee, we get a lot of requests from soon to be retired or retired lawyers about volunteering. And it's very hard for us to work that into our system because you don't want to call someone at 5 p.m. on a Friday and ask them to vet a story over the weekend, right? It's challenging to do that. But we would love to have some mentors for our younger lawyers. And in this case, they don't have to be former or retired, or I should say retired or even practicing lawyers, just people who've been professionals and they've had, interesting careers. And I think that the young lawyers really need and crave that kind of mentoring. I was really lucky when I was younger in a newsroom and the world seemed topsy-turvy to me, and you have some older people saying to you, oh yeah, but 1968, that was so much worse than anything that's happening right now. And I don't know, it centers you a little bit to hear that perspective. And also, in addition into supporting, local journalists like Francia, since my board chair had, the gall of being Harvard Radcliffe class of 77, not 73, he couldn't be here today, but he would want me to urge everyone to support RCFP. And that's Stephen Adler, former EIC of Reuters, and he's been our board chair for many years and has really been a key part of RCFP's growth.
Well, and we've been grateful to Dick, who's class of 79. So we take all comers.
Yeah.
Uh, and David.
Uh, I'm going to combine the last two comments, which is that I hope that you'll write that check to Reporters Committee and support their good work. And I do hope you'd support local journalism. But beyond just local journalism, I'd say pay for some journalism. It's very simple. Don't be me when you come to the paywall and they ask you to pay. Don't move on to something else. And it's a multitude of ways to do this, whether it's becoming a life partner for This American Life, whether it's not ignoring those pitches on NPR, whether it's getting that special status for any of the great news websites. The money makes a difference.
Thank you. And Dick.
First of all, I want to thank the panelists for joining us. And part of my appreciation is to say that supporting any or all of their organizations or any of the other ones that they mentioned or suggested, I think is absolutely necessary. It is a way to vote with your feet in the and with your wallet in the moment that we are in. The press needs your support. Only other thing that I would say is to going back to David's point about hearts and minds that we talked about earlier. When you're in conversations with your friends, your neighbors, your family, and people are attacking or questioning the press, I hope you will remind people that they too are Americans trying very hard to do an important job and hold this country together through a really difficult moment. And again, thanks for having us all.
And thank you to all of you. ClassACT also has calls to action, and certainly we agree with everything you said in terms of support of our news organizations, both large and small. We have also had a comment in the chat that we suggested that we share the videos and resources, all of us as individuals, with our local news outlets so that they can see what you all have said, as well as with all of our friends. So we suggest that you do that. And finally, it is our privilege and civic duty to vote. And voting is going to make a huge difference for us in our future and for our freedoms, of which this is one of the most important. So we encourage you to vote and to talk to people about voting. Find some young people who may not be quite convinced that they need to vote and encourage them to do so. So with that, we'll complete the calls to action. And now I want to thank all four of you. What an extraordinary conversation. We've learned so much, and we feel so buoyed by the work that you and all of your colleagues do throughout our nation and throughout the world. I want to thank also our Freedom of the Press program leaders, Jackie Swearingen and Ryan O'Connell, and our Justice and Civic Engagement leaders, Therese Steiner and Bahman Mosavar Romani, for developing this program. We have a great production team in John Noren, Jackie Swearingen, Sarah Ulrich, Richard Jackma, Diana Labanchuk, Kate Freed, Katie Marinello, and our wonderful videographer, Rick Brotman. And finally, we want to thank everybody who has attended this evening. So we thank you. Please share this widely. Good evening.